Hello everyone again, and welcome to Hitting the Mark. In my first program, I made mention of things that we would cover, from extreme worldwide weather conditions to events in the heavens to global financial problems, and that's what we're going to be taking a look at this week. So, a little while ago, I talked about a story in the Gospel of Luke concerning two men on the road to Emmaus who were sad, confused about events in their lives, namely the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Yeshua. While they're walking, our risen Savior joins them, and he begins to help them to understand these events by pointing them to a particular place in time and a specific person. The place was the book of Deuteronomy in the Torah, and the person was Moses. Last week, I covered the parallels between President Lincoln and President Kennedy concerning the printing of interest-free and debt-free money and its effect on their lives and ours today. Two specific people and two particular places in time. Now, I'm certain if we took the time and looked closely at our own lives, we could find many places, many times, and people and events that change the course of our life. Whatever situation we find ourselves in today, perhaps was the result of a person, persons, place, and a time that influenced our current circumstances. Our current economic position concerning the tremendous debt our country is burdened with stems from a certain place and time. Right now, our economy is what you would call debt-based. It used to be set up on something called thrift-based. Not many are aware of this, but our debt load of today actually started in 1963, soon after President Kennedy was assassinated. Today, I'd like to take you back to a place and a time and a people that make up the source of our present-day economic problems. First, however, let's look at some background concerning money. There was a time when gold was the currency of the era. Goldsmiths, financiers, and bankers would hold the gold deposits of its customers. When a depositor would require some of his holdings, they would be given a note, signifying that there was in fact gold to cover the amount. Over time, the goldsmiths and bankers noticed that there was always a sizable amount of gold in holding that their customers, mainly due to their thrift and sacrificial living, did not withdraw. So the goldsmiths and the financiers decided to loan the reserves of their customers' gold deposits and charge interest, or usury, which we talked about last week. This was a pretty good deal. Think about this. They get to keep money that's not theirs, they get to loan money that's not theirs, and they get to collect interest off money that does not belong to them. Now, for years, gold would be moved around by shipping and overland. However, due to storms, pirates, the gold shipments could be lost or stolen. Because of this, it was decided to store gold in certain locations throughout Europe and cut losses by not shipping gold from place to place, either by ship or overland. Over centuries of lending people's money reserves and charging interest, something evolved called fractionalized banking. This means that a fraction of the money in holding would be loaned out. An example would be for every dollar in your account, the bank could loan out $10. So if you had $1,000 in your account, the bank may loan as high as $900 of that account. This started out by loaning money and charging interest to individuals. This worked okay for some time, but if people fell on hard times, it became difficult to replace the original loan amount, not to mention the profit due to interest charged. Fractionalized banking first failed in Amsterdam in 1610 due to people being unable to repay their loans for various reasons. Then there was a move to loan money mainly to governments instead of individuals. This was done because the government receiving the loan could easily pay it back with interest by the taxation of its citizens. Soon these notes turned into the paper currency we are familiar with today in our world. In our nation, the U.S. Supreme Court outlawed the income tax in 1895. However, after the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, that same year, the 16th Amendment was passed, reinstating the income tax. Since 1914, we pay interest on every dollar created, which is why the income tax was reinstated. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement made the dollar the world's reserve currency. This agreement, signed at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, outlined rules and regulations for an international monetary system. It established a fixed exchange rate linked to the U.S. dollar, with other countries pegging their currency to the dollar. This agreement created the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. By the 1970s, the fixed exchange rate collapsed because the U.S. would no longer exchange the dollar for gold. At that point, we entered into something called fiat money, which we're going to cover a little later today. In 1971, then President Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard. The decade that followed experienced some of the worst inflation in our history. Now, I've spoken to you before of the need to hear voices from our past that we no longer hear or have long forgotten that we really need to return to. I'd like you to pay attention for a moment to the words of then President Andrew Jackson. This is 1832, and I'm quoting, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the axe of government to their selfish purposes. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to add titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors for themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. Now, all governments around the globe, mainly what they do is set up laws and all kinds of other things for no other purpose than to confiscate the money of their citizens. I know that doesn't sound good, but that is the truth. President Jackson summarized his policies this way: the federal Constitution must be obeyed, states' rights preserved, our national debt must be paid, direct taxes and loans avoided, and the federal union preserved. In 1835, President Jackson saw to it that our national debt was paid. He waged a huge battle concerning conspiracy and monopoly within the Bank of the United States. He stood for equality before the law and no unwarranted centralization, whether in politics or economics. President Jackson concluded that a moneyed institution possessing the power to precipitate panics, to influence government action, was dangerous to the peace, prosperity, and liberty of the people. And a few weeks ago, I read you a verse from Luke 4 concerning Yeshua's saying that he came to set at liberty those that were bruised. And right now, after the economic mess that we've all come through, there are many, many people in this nation who are bruised. In 1832, Congress voted to maintain the status quo with the central financial institution. President Jackson, however, vetoed that legislation, and he removed all government funds from that bank. For just a moment, I want to cover fiat money and some of the horrendous problems that it's caused. Fiat money is currency that a government declares to be legal, but in fact is not backed by any physical commodity. The value of fiat money is derived from a relationship between, and this is important, supply and demand, rather than the value of the material that the money's made of. Because fiat money is not linked to any physical reserve, it runs the risk of becoming worthless due to hyperinflation. If people lose faith in a nation's paper currency like the dollar, the money will no longer hold any value. Most modern paper currencies are fiat. They have no backing, they have no intrinsic value, and are used solely as a means of payment. Fiat money is inconvertible and can't be redeemed. You can't turn it in and get anything except more fiat money. It rose to prominence in the 20th century after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, when the United States ceased to allow the conversion of the dollar into gold. I'd like to share with you the history of fiat money and the effects it's had on several nations of the world. This is rather shocking. In 1922 in Austria, they had 134% inflation rate due to fiat failures. In 1944, Greece's prices doubled every 26 hours. Hungary in 1946 had 4.19 quintillion% inflation. It doubled every 15 hours. In 1984, Israel had 445% inflation. And this list goes on and it gets worse, this being the worst one. As recently as 2007, in Zimbabwe, Africa, 11,250,000% inflation at its worst month. So fiat money really has a very, very slippery foundation under it. However, its one purpose, along with many other things in the economy, is this. I want to quote you something that is pointing us towards a one-world government, a one-world economy, and a one-world religion. Listen to this quote. "We will have a world government, whether you like it or not. The only question is whether that government will be achieved by conquest or consent." That is a European banker named James Paul Warburg. That was February 17th, 1950, and he's sitting in front of the United States Senate. So everything, all the failures that you see, all the booms that we've had, these are not chance happenings. These are planned events. Let's look a little further at the history of fiat money. It started in Rome with coins and it failed. The Chinese started using paper money, and they used to call it flying money because it would be in and out of their hands so fast it was unbelievable. In the 11th century, a bank in the Sichuan province of China issued paper money in exchange for iron coins. Initially, it didn't work too bad until they started running out of coins. So we have a very long history of what fiat money has done to nations. In the latter part of the 18th century, the French government again tried to give paper money another chance. This time, it really went wild. In 1795, inflation ran at 13,000%. On the scene steps Napoleon, bringing with him the gold franc, which stabilized the currency of the nation, and it was very good for the duration of his reign. After Waterloo had come and gone, the French gave it another go of fiat money in the 1930s. It took 12 years for them to inflate their currency until it lost 99% of its value. Now, I want to turn to Germany right now and show you how fast this can happen when it does happen. The German mark compared to the dollar. In April of 1919, 12 marks to $1. 2 years later, in November of 1921, it was 263 marks to $1. Now, from January 1923 to December 1923, it went from 17,000 marks per dollar to 4.2 trillion marks per dollar. The Germans were using their marks to burn in their furnaces to keep warm. It was so worthless. So the dollar being taken off the gold standard in 1971 under President Nixon completely severed all the ties between the dollar and the gold standard. And during the decade after President Nixon did this, we experienced some of the worst inflation in history. Now, when we look at the currency issues and we look at all the wars, we need to understand that if you look back in our history since 1914, we have been engaged in more than 16 military conflicts. We've been involved in some form of violent international accord in 44 of the past 93 years. Every overwhelming military conflict has always resulted in some form of monetary inflation. Now, the dollar, truthfully, is failing. It has lost 92% of its value since it was issued in 1913. So we now are in a very precarious position. And most of this happened for two reasons. The creating of the Federal Reserve, which sole purpose is to create a boom and a bust. Not long ago, Mr. Bernanke finally told everybody that the crash of '29 was due to the Federal Reserve. I want to read you something from another voice of the past. This is a concurring opinion concerning the change in income tax. This is written by Justice Stephen Field. He denounced the tax as follows: "This present assault on capital is but the beginning. It will be but a stepping stone to others, larger and more sweeping, until our political contest will become a war of the poor against the rich, a war constantly growing in intensity and bitterness. If the court sanctions the power of discriminating taxation and nullifies the uniformity mandate of the Constitution, it will mark the hour when the sure decadence of our government will commence." Unquote. Now, in Britain, there was a time when they decided to free up the marketplace, and it led to vast economic expansion. Indeed, they repealed their income tax. When they did, the British enjoyed 60 years of the greatest increase in living standards in their history, while government expenditures dropped as a percent of the gross national product from 15 to 8. Those years were 1830 to 1890, 60 years of increased living standards. On this side of the Atlantic, the gross national product of the United States grew 4 times as fast as government spending until the application of the income tax in 1914. After that, it was the growth of government which outpaced the growth of the nation. So I'm hoping that by hearing this, that you will hopefully come to understand that the reason we're here today in this economic chaos is not by chance. It is an absolute direct plan, and we are still going down that road. We don't know just exactly when all these things will take place, but the scriptures are very clear that there will be at some point in time a one world government through the economy, through the military, and through religion. So all of this is not just chance happenings. These are very dedicated groups of men around the globe who have been and still are working their plan for world dominion. If you read the scriptures and begin to understand what is going on, I would caution everyone listening, do all in your power to get out of debt that you're in, and all in your power to stay out of any future debt, if at all possible. Next year, in 2014, we're going to enter into a time in the heavens where for the next 2 years we will see a phenomenon not seen since the 60s. This is called blood moons. And historically, blood moons are not good for Israel nor the United States. So I would hope that you would take a good look at the scriptures, because they are the only guide we will ever have to get us through the coming perils that are for sure ahead of us. I know this is not good news. I know that this is not going to make you feel good, but I would rather that you be informed than feel good. So I would just ask you to continue to study, to continue to stay in prayer. Do all that you can do to stay out of debt. And once again, when this goes down, you will hear these words, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind." And here they are, "to set at liberty those that are bruised." This economy, if we keep going like we are, is going to steal and eat away at our liberty. And there's no reason for that. We can do this much differently, but we need to listen to voices of the past. We need to pray, and we need, if we ever needed, this is the time to be wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. I hope to be with you next week. I hope you have a great week. I hope your 2014 is a wonderful year for you and your families. And thank you very much for listening to Hitting the Mark. God bless you.